Alrighty, I recorded this video once before and I just came off as a little bit too sarcastic, and I just kind of wanted to cut away all of that because nobody deserves to be beaten down, right? But I've gotten pinged a lot today, very specifically about all of my builds, the fact that all of them are wrong, the fact that calculations are all wrong, everybody is wrong, and this person has cracked the code, this secret to how damage works. And honestly, if this is just kind of like a bait, GG, you got the bait. I'm not going to react to their video. But basically this screen right here is the entire summation of what the video tries to explain to people. And it is that every single person putting out build guides right now, including Blizzard, have no idea how damage works in the game. We're all wrong about how damage adds to buckets. It's actually that critical strike damage and multipliers there don't multiply your damage at all. It only multiplies part of your additive bucket. And this is a very old myth, basically a wives' tale at this point, that continues to get peddled around, and it's completely because the character screen in this game lies to you. Now, and I'm just going to use this as a self-plug real quick. If you've never seen my video on how damage works, so the label of the video is that damage good for your build? How does damage work? Deep dive. I break down every single stat in the game using a real example of a Bone Spirit Necromancer, and how you should seek to calculate your damage, but not only that, understand the interrelationships between additive damages and multipliers, etc. It's a 50-minute long video. I have timestamps for everything, but one of the things I really try to nail down is the fact that critical strike damage in your character sheet has been lying to you the entire time. Like most things in the character sheets of various Diablo games, they're all lying. And sadly, the creator of this video was caught in the trap of the lying character screen. Now let me just very quickly explain basically what this screen is saying to you and how it actually works. And then I'll prove it in game just so that you can see it, so that everybody actually has data and proof in video, so that you don't have to worry about where that information is coming from. But what the video presupposes is that how we all think damage works is completely wrong. The idea is that you have 100% of your base damage. That's what this 100% represents right here. And that when you're considering your additive damage bucket, if you crit, let's say, for example, you had 900 additive damage, you had 100 crit damage, then you would add those two together, you would get a new multiplier, and then you would multiply everything by 50%. Because that's what critical strike damage says on the tin, and it's what every one of your favorite creators and guide writers has been running off of this entire time. Now, what the video supposes is that this is completely incorrect, and that in reality, what happens is you take 100% of your base damage, and then inside of your additive bucket, you have your 900 all damage. Then you take your 100 additive damage multiplied by 50%. And then you add 50% to that, because that's kind of what the tooltip does. And I'll break that down in a second. And then this formula actually doesn't even necessarily represent exactly the point that the person is trying to make, because there should be a 1 here plus the additive plus parentheses, this multiplied by 1.5 end parentheses, plus 50 end parentheses divided by 100 to get to an integer multiplier. Then you multiply that by your base skill damage is what would actually be occurring. So even this formula is slightly off, but I promise I'm going to stop punching down at this point. But the reason why you're led to believe this thing is because of how your sheet damage in your character screen represents to you how much damage you have. So if we were to look at my character sheet, and this is my Blight Necromancer, so this is not built for doing bone spear damage, but that's what I used as the test so that we could minimize as many variables as possible here. You'll see that I have critical strike damage of 50%, but also that I have 0 critical strike damage from items in Paragon. So why would this number ever show me a 50%? Well, the equation that the video supposes says that you just add 50% crit damage to your total after, and that even if you add 0 and you multiply that by 1.5 or 50%, right? You would take 0 multiplied by 1.5, which is 0, and then you would add 50 to it. So that's how you get to 50 additive crit damage. And that's what they say would happen if you had no crit damage. And that's weird, right? What would lead you to believe that? Well, let's go ahead and add some critical strike damage to my character. I'm going to use Essence. Essence here adds 81.3 critical strike damage. I'll get rid of my example, but here I have 81.3 critical strike damage. That's how much I should have, because that's how much I just added to my character when I had 0. But you'll notice that my character screen says I have 171.9 critical strike damage. How did we possibly get to this number? Well, if we use the video example, right, if we go back to that example, The idea is that you'll take your critical strike damage, you multiply that by 1.5, and then you'll add 50%. Okay, let's go ahead and run that example. I take this, I take my number, and I multiply that by 1.5, and I get to 121. And then, oddly enough, if you add that quote-unquote base critical strike damage of 50%, you get up to the critical strike damage that's shown in my character screen. But it would be so weird if it worked like that, right? It would be absolutely bananas buck wild if something in the game that says it increases your damage by 50%, and if you had 0, all that you would get out of it is 50 additive damage. Now, luckily for us, it is very, very easy for us to see this in-game and to disprove what the video supports, what the video proposes, and you could go do this in-game right now if you really wanted to. But what I did is I walked up to this little monster right here. Let me go ahead and remove essence. Let me go ahead and show you my critical strike damage again. Just 50%. The video supposes that I would just add 50 additive damage to my character. Now, the funny part about this is if you had no other stats in the game, the video would almost support this. Because if you have no other additive damage and you add 50 to your additive damage bucket, and then you multiply that by your base damage, you do get a 50% increase in damage. But let's go ahead and add on a ton of additive damage. Dilute that pool, make it so that adding 50 damage into it wouldn't be nearly as strong. Well, how are we going to go ahead and do that? Well, I have a ton of just generic damage here. I have a ton of generic damage here. I have things like damage to close here. I have damage to elite monsters. But let me just go ahead and look down at all the damage that we have. Here in my all damage bucket, I have 346 all damage, just generic damage, so 346. And then I also have damage to close. So I had 346, right? That's what that said. This is now 352 additive damage that will be relevant. And then I also have 83 damage to elites. So I have just over 430 additive damage. Well, this is a boss training dummy, and I can sit here and I can cast Bone Spear. And if I were to sit here and cast Bone Spear enough and show you the difference between the minimum damage and the maximum damage, between crits and non-crits, obviously we'll ignore overpowers right now, but if I were to go through and I would show you this damage, and get enough data points to make that data strong enough, and I proved that critical strike damage is indeed a global multiplier, always has been a global multiplier, and the character screen is always lying to you and you should never believe it, would you subscribe to the channel? Would you do that? Go ahead and do that for me. If I prove it to you, and you like the way that I proved it to you, go ahead and subscribe to the channel, leave a like on the video as well. It would help me out a whole bunch. You don't want to be missing out on this type of stuff because you want to be as informed as possible while playing this game and not waste your time respecking and retempering and throwing away all your gear just because a character screen lied to us, which is going to happen in Diablo games. It's kind of par for the course. But if I were to go through and collect, I don't know, about 40 data points, both for critting and without critting, and then I were to compare the minimum, the maximum, the average, the difference, and then also compare those two numbers together, what amount of a damage increase are you expecting to see? Are you expecting to just see a difference of adding 50 more additive damage to a pool that already has over 400 damage? So changing my multiplier there from 5 times damage to 5.5 times damage, which is only representative of a 10% increase in damage? Or would you expect the 50% damage multiplier? Well, let's go ahead and look at it. Without critting, our minimum damage was 21,739 damage. With crits, our minimum damage was 33,109. The difference between those two things is about 52%. Obviously, if I got more data points, I would have a more accurate min for both of these, and that difference would get closer and closer to a 50% true increase in damage between the two data sets. Similarly, for our max damage, without critting, I did about 34,000 damage. With critting, I did about 54,000 damage. The difference between those two things is 60% damage increase. For our average damage, we saw 27,000 without critting, 41,000, just about 42,000. With critting, and the difference between that is 53%. And if you look at the range between our minimum and our maximum, because you have to remember the fact that a weapon has a 50% damage range and your skill has a 20% damage range, multiply those two things together, you should see a total of an 80% difference between your minimum and maximum. The more data points you get, the more likely you are to see those lower ends, right? You're more likely to see numbers in the average because there's more numbers in the average than there are at the end or the min and maximum. But The range for our without critting was about 56% damage difference, and the range for our with critting was about a 64% damage difference. So the data set is at least strong enough to show that amount of difference between the weapon range and a little bit of the skill range. But it's clear as day. Your critical strike damage is a global multiplier. Your vulnerable damage is a global multiplier. Your overpower damage is a global multiplier. If you were to overpower, if you were to crit, if you were to vulnerable, you would increase your damage by 1.5 and then increase it by 1.5 again, and then increase it by 1.2. And then any additive damage that you have would all get into your additive damage bucket and would increase that by an amount. Again, my video here talks about all of this already. Sometimes it kind of stinks having to make like the same video twice, but we have to be able to react to stuff. And I just want to get this out here because I totally understand how this confusion happens. I absolutely, truly sympathize with what leads to this happening. It's just not true. And it's very easily provable in game how untrue it is. And I hope that nobody went and drastically changed their build based off of this thing. Again, if it's just like mostly meant to be bait, that's perfectly fine. You get your 15 minutes of fame, right? There's nothing wrong with that. But I really hope that nobody was negatively impacted by this, because it's just like provably false in game very quick with a very simple test that anybody can go do themselves. But there you go. I just wanted to bring this up. I was working on 3 other videos, one talking about how this flat damage bonus actually doubles up on dot damage. So look forward to that as well. And also an interesting bug that happens with the aphotic minion based aspect that actually drastically increases your cooldown reduction from Decrepify, because that's bugged too, because everything in this game is bugged. I just want to put this out there. Again, if you haven't already subscribed to the channel, I might just be showing up in your algorithm and you never click that button. Toss a like onto the video if I did prove it to you and you did like it. If not, go ahead and let me know down in the comments if there's anything I can do to better illustrate this difference, or if you come across any different data or find some weird phenomena that supports something different. I'd love to hear from you. I try to answer every single comment whenever I can. As always, thank you so much for watching this video. I truly hope that it helps you to enjoy it better, and I look forward to seeing you in the next one.